Hi, everyone who's joining. It's nice to see you all. Thanks for making time. We'll give folks another couple minutes to get into the room because it looks like we still are short quite a few people, and then we will go ahead and get started.
That sounds good, Dr. Sutter.
All right, excellent. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. This is our fourth meeting of the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. The deck that you received earlier today in an email from Alex is the one we'll be using tonight. You also have a link to a Google Drive that has a lot of documents that I'll reference this evening. So if you don't have that handy, you may want to go into your email, find that link to the Google Drive, and just have it readily available, because we'll be referencing some of the documents that are in there and using a few of them in our work together tonight. So here's our agenda for our time together. We built in a little bit of cushion for things just like this, getting started a few minutes late. I want to remind folks that we're just past the midpoint now of our time together as an advisory committee before we put guiding principles in the hands of the state board, ask the state board to adopt those principles and pass them on to OSSE for the new writing or revision of the DC Social Studies standards. So tonight we're going to do two big things. One, we're going to talk about the survey results from the public input survey that was actually a suggestion of the CISAC at our last meeting. We're very excited to share with you what we learned. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time together working on a process of getting to consensus on our guiding principles. We're going to have some time in small groups to discuss a few open questions that we have some uncertainty on as an advisory committee. We're going to review the draft guiding principles that our staff and co-facilitators have pulled together from all of the input you all have provided over the past few months. And then we're going to settle on a decision-making process, how we will actually work to get to a consensus on a common set of guiding principles that this committee feels good about sending to the state board and on to OSSE. One thing I want to point out is that we're going to try and create a process of consensus, and it will be imperfect. There will be iterations of it. We'll have discussion, and we'll do our best to get to a place where everyone supports the principles we put forward. But as we've discussed before, there were a few ideas about how we might identify places where there is not consensus and how we might treat those in providing our recommendations to OSSE. So know that we're cognizant of that process as we go into these remaining meetings, and remain determined to try our best to get to a place of consensus and to moderate and modify the process as we need to make sure that folks feel like the process was good, fair, appropriate, and one that you all can stand behind as we put these recommendations forward for the standards revision. So without further ado, here are our objectives for this evening. We're going to review the input from the survey. We're going to try to get to a process of consensus on the guiding principles, and we'll try to work towards some response on the open questions that still remain, some of which were the first questions we raised in our first meeting together. So some of the things we started on, we're circling back to today, and hope to come away with some more concrete responses to those questions. As a reminder, here is who is in the virtual room with you all. And again, you have this deck if you want to refer to it to remind yourself of who might be speaking at any given time. Our norms for tonight, I think the most important here for me tonight is to practice divergent thinking, to be sure that if there's a place where you think we haven't quite gotten it right, you speak up. Speak up in the room, share your thoughts, make sure that we are working to get it right and that we hear your voice. So I would also say number 3 feels very important tonight, to make space and take space. I know some folks feel more comfortable speaking up in a room and others prefer to write out their thoughts for later. Feel free to use the chat tonight if that's more comfortable, but I do hope that folks will share their thoughts in tonight's live session so that we can work together on this process of consensus building. The more that we get to actually share the mic tonight, whether that mic is typing in the chat or speaking aloud, I think the better responses we're going to get to in our guiding principles. So our public input survey. When we last met in September, we talked about getting public input on guiding principles, and I'm very appreciative that the CISAC spent time to back up a little bit and say, we actually need to engage the public on a more general set of questions. We need to ask the public what they think of the current social studies standards. We need to get their input on what they think is good and what they think students should know and be able to do by the time they graduate. So with that good push, the State Board created a 3-question survey for public input that was live for more than 3 weeks, beginning on September 16th and going through last Friday, October the 9th. We had flyers with QR codes that we posted and shared around town. Some of you may have seen them. They look like this. Folks were able to then take a photo of the QR code and take the survey right on their mobile device. We also had a link for folks to enter. We shared those at meal distribution sites and various community locations around the city. We also distributed the electronic link widely, both on social media, through email lists, and with various community contacts. We shared it with every ANC in the city, with all of the ward education councils, with DC public schools, with public charter school leadership. And we're very pleased to say that we got back more than 260 responses to the survey. So what you can see here is where we got our responses from. We definitely had a overrepresentation of DC public schools students and parents in the survey as compared to public charter school students, knowing that we've got roughly half and half in the city. We definitely got a larger set of responses from folks associated with DC public schools. We also got a fair amount of responses from folks associated with private and parochial schools, and then quite a few from folks who said self-identified as not having children in the schools. Ward 3 came in strong with responses. I'm curious exactly as to how that happened, but I know that our Ward 3 member, our State Board President, Ruth Wattenberg, shared the survey widely. I also have a hunch that we had some student responses, so my sense is that perhaps one or more of our Ward 3 teachers shared the survey, and we got a solid number of responses from students at schools in Ward 3. But we're pleased that we did get representation from across the city. And by and large, on the Likert scale question we asked of how satisfied you are with social studies classes and learning to which you or your children have been exposed to, we found that folks were moderately dissatisfied. 1 was not very satisfied, 4 was very satisfied, and you can see here that the distribution skews towards dissatisfied. Rather than sharing with you all the themes that came out of the survey, you have in your Google Drive folder, the CISAC folder for tonight's meeting, has a PDF of all the qualitative responses we got back. So you can read all the survey responses we received. 2 things I would point out are that a lot of the responses tracked very closely with some of what you have said in your own responses to how the standards are. We heard a lot about concerns for lack of representation in the standards. We heard about a need for LGBTQ history to be represented, for disability to be represented, for Latino history, especially in DC history, to be represented. We heard calls for more civics. We heard calls for more and different telling of Black history in America. So the responses largely track to the same kinds of things you all have shared with us. I'm glad to see that because it feels like a strong confirmation of the fact that our advisory council is providing us with some representative feedback similar to that we're getting in the survey. One thing that is different in the survey feedback.
Come on.
Oh, sorry. One thing that is different in the survey feedback is that we did get a few responses, and again, you've got the PDF so you can see them for yourself. We had a few responses from individuals who raised concern over the standards being rewritten with an activist lens or being rewritten as a social justice curriculum. We had a few folks specifically say, please don't make the new standards propaganda. So I want to draw that to your attention when you review them. Those were definitely minority comments, but they are in there, and that is something very different than we've heard from our advisory committee. So I did want to call that out. Before I move on to our next part of the agenda, are there any questions that you all have about the public input survey?
I think, like, as a DC resident, I grew up here thinking that with the awareness that folks in Ward 3, I think we said, had the highest number of respondents. that kind of shakes down to what my experiences have been, because Ward 3 is like near American University. What is it? Janie and Wilson. And so I'm just really wondering I wonder what other opportunities, like as we continue to go, can we get folks east of the river, west of the park? Because I know that one person emailed me directly, was like, look, I've looked at this several times. I just don't even know how to give meaningful feedback. I tried, but it just didn't gel. So I'm just wondering how we can continue to make feedback and public input accessible for a variety of different folks. I think we did an amazing job. The team did an amazing job circulating a survey. But that's one thing I'm committed to. How can I get other voices as well to help me bring that feedback here to inspire the guiding principles?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jessica. So we will definitely talk about making sure that our next round of public feedback, when we have the concrete guiding principles to share, can follow some of the same principles that you all asked us to do this time around. So we did put the survey out in multiple languages. At last count, we had not received very many, if any, responses in the languages we had the survey translated into. So I think the effort, the input was good, but the outcome, we did not necessarily get what we hoped for, which was broad responses from folks in non-English speaking communities. So I do think it would be helpful to keep thinking about how we further adjust our outreach or our tactics to make sure that when we bring the guiding principles draft out for public comment, that we also accompany it with sort of a quick explainer on what these are and where we are in the process, as well as thinking about how do we get that meaningful feedback back. We have a few minutes if folks have thoughts on that now and want to raise them or make some suggestions.
I'm not sure that this is a suggestion, but I had lots of people who kind of felt like that they weren't the right ones to respond to it. Maybe their kids had graduated or their kids were, for a variety of reasons, they thought that their input wasn't valid. And so the way I reframed it was to say, as a district resident, what do you want the students of DC to graduate from DC schools knowing? And when I framed it that way, that they were able to bite into that more. So I'm interested in maybe perhaps when we plan community outreach next time, frame it in a way that everyone feels like that their voice matters. And try and identify, to Jessica's point, I guess I want to be more proactive about anticipating any possible hurdles to this. So, this was certainly informative, definitely, but again, just trying to identify hurdles and figure out language that makes it more accessible, that everyone feels like they have a stake in it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. I think that the accessible language, including the framing, so that folks see themselves as desired respondents, I think that's really important. I also think I appreciate some of the comments folks have put in the chat around listening circles or interviews. And to Sarah, your good point, which I think echoes this, you made this personal outreach to folks. So having a touch that is a human touch in addition to sort of a link in the distance, so that folks do feel like they can get context or get affirmation that, yes, you really are the person we want to hear from. And here's why. Karen, thanks for that insight as well, that making sure we reread it and make sure students can see themselves in it as we ask them to fill it out so that they don't feel like they've wandered into the wrong survey. If folks have additional thoughts on this, on the way that we engage folks citywide, to get the kind of responses that we are seeking, which is broadly diverse, voices of students, making sure we get strong response rates from east of the river, west of the park, as well as folks who are not native English speakers. Keep us posted on how we can do that. We are not going to have another round of public feedback between this meeting and our November meeting, but we will engage the public again following our November meeting. So we have some time to think and strategize, and your input is going to be invaluable there. Okay, seeing a couple other comments in the chat, and we'll be saving the chat so we can go through this later. I'm going to move us from the feedback portion here to getting into our conversation about the open questions and guiding principles, because last time we connected, it was experts talking and then me talking, not so much you talking. Tonight, I want to make it mostly you talking. So as a refresher, we have talked about what a guiding principle is, what we're trying to get to OSSE. And we're saying that it's a statement that will provide OSSE and their technical writing committee information on how to revise or rewrite the existing standards. We want those statements to be clear and actionable for standards writers, and we're aiming for a manageable list for 15 to 20 guiding principles. Quick updates on where we stand on our process to get to that deliverable. Between the September meeting and tonight, we asked members to provide us input on the guiding principles in an individual worksheet. And again, this was thanks to your good feedback that we adjusted the process and gave folks an individual chance to tell us what they thought they would say in different buckets of kinds of guiding principles that OSSE is looking for, and what specific input or feedback they would give to OSSE on existing standards that would be good examples or anti-examples of what they meant in the guiding principle. We got 15 of those worksheets back from CISAC members, and SBOE staff worked tirelessly to combine all those responses into one large Google spreadsheet. They also included all of the feedback that CISAC members provided during previous meetings and via Google Docs, and they put those into a large Excel spreadsheet that you can find in your Google Drive, and that's CISAC Google Drive. I believe it's called Consolidated Guiding Principles. It's a Excel doc, and they're coded by both the big idea, and those are the sort of categories from the OSSE sheet that we worked on together as a group, and then by themes, the kinds of sort of themes that emerged as we read through your feedback. The SBOE staff and the CISAC co-chairs then drafted a proposed list of 23 guiding principles for your review and consideration tonight that pulled from that spreadsheet, and we put that in a Word doc. So you should be able to also see that in your CISAC Google Drive. Basically, we want to make sure you have all the source material that we generated things from so that you can not only hear how we did it, but actually see that we took that list of more than almost 300 guiding principle ideas and narrowed it down to clusters, things that seem to hang together, that seem to be repeated themes. And we put those together because we think that we have captured the key themes that rise to the top of all that you've said. We're not sure we got it right. That's why we're going to go through this tonight and double check it with you. But we think that we've got about 23 of these potential guiding principles that we need to still wordsmith. We need to make more concrete. We need to make tighter in their language. But we think they start to pull out the high points of a lot of what we've talked about. Even with all of that good feedback you gave us, there are still a few topics that we don't have a set of ideas on. For tonight, we're going to call those open questions. And we've put those up at the top of that Word doc. There are 4 that we seem to think stand out as totally unresolved, but that have come up in conversation again and again, and that come up in your guiding principles notes. It's just that they don't hang together in agreement. There are some folks who think one way and others who think another way, and we think that more discussion is needed, in particular on these topics. So I want to propose how we spend the rest of our evening together tonight. open to friendly amendments and to tweaks. So let me know if this doesn't sound right. But here's the proposal. I'd like us to spend some time in small groups considering those open questions. I want to put folks in groups of about 5 to talk through these 4 open questions that we identified and see where you stand within your own group. We've got some directions on how the small groups will work with a recorder, with a presenter, so that we can hear what the thinking is from individual members of the group as well as the group as a whole. We want to have that shared out tonight. Once we go through that process, we want to turn our attention to those proposed guiding principles. And we want to actually do a visual vote of a fist to 5 format. The idea being that some of these you will read and say, yeah, you'll wordsmith that and tighten it up, but yes, I can get on board with that. I'm fine. I'm a 5. Some of them you'll read and go, this is totally not what I had in mind. This is entirely outside the realm of what I was thinking. I'm not good with this. I'm going to give you my fist because this is not something I will agree to move ahead on. And then you may find yourself in between on any number of those. And we'll use that process tonight to try and move us from the 23 principles towards some that are a clear yes, some that are more clear no, and others that require more discussion and development. That will then help us figure out how to spend our time in the next month between meetings and what we still need to do at our November meeting to get to a more concrete list for public review. So with this as a proposed process, what are your questions, thoughts, ideas, amendments? You can feel free to raise your hand in the chat, only because I can't see you all on my screen. It looks like Nick has a question.
Hi, good evening. This might be a dumb question. In the document that has the guiding principles, the draft, the consolidated ones, like on the right column, there's numbers. What do those numbers mean?
Good question. So on that document, the draft document that has the proposed guiding principles in a table of text, the numbers on the left are 1 to 23 to just identify which ones we're talking about. The numbers on the right correspond to the Excel row that we pulled your ideas and text from. So basically it's a source guide. Like, here's where we pulled those ideas from. Some of them we pasted everybody's words. Some of them we consolidated down, like the list of underrepresentation or lack of representation in the standards. We listed out all the rows we pulled from, but we didn't list everybody's individual language. We instead reduced it down to a list of groups or people who were underrepresented in the standards. Good question. Other questions on the proposed process? Molly, are you asking about, like, are there times that we'll talk about to go through to spend on each of these pieces tonight?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Like, how much time on each piece of this?
Great question. So for our open questions, we'll put you in groups of 5 people, and each group will have 30 minutes to talk through those 4 topics. I'll actually come to the next slide and we can always go back. So you'll have 30 minutes in your group to go through the process, and then we'll come together and we'll share out for 15 minutes before moving on to our getting to consensus, where we'll go through all 23, which I think will take us roughly 25 to 30 minutes. And then we'll do any discussion that we have time for on principles where there was not a strong consensus. All right. So we're still a few minutes ahead of time, which is good. And I think that that'll give us more time for moving through additional conversation at the end. So hearing no other concerns about process yet, I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and move on to the open questions small group discussion. And after that discussion, if folks have more thoughts on process, we'll come back to this and revisit it. Sound okay? All right. So we're going to move you into breakout rooms because WebEx can do that now, which is super exciting. And we're going to go ahead and ask you to consider these 4 open questions that the group has not yet seemed to reach any sort of theme on. Do we want our standards to be presented by grade level or by grade band? And as a reminder, this is do we want pre-K 3 standards and pre-K 4 standards and kindergarten standards, or do we want pre-K 3 through kindergarten standards? Second open question, do we want to keep the current themes that are tagged in current DC standards? And here in the parentheses, you can see those themes. A number of you reference them in your feedback. Or do we want to create and add new themes that would be coded throughout the standards? We talked about the C3 framework a number of times, and a number of you referenced it in your feedback. What do we think? Is there a role for including some aspects of the framework in our standards? What's our position on that? And then finally, there was a lot of different thinking on this last point. Do we include specific lists of people, places, events, dates? Do we not include any of that? Or do we include some sort of different or less specific list? So those are your 4 questions. This is what we're asking of you. When you go into the group, you'll identify a recorder who will take notes in the shared Google Doc. And thanks to our awesome staff, the Google Doc link is in the chat. You'll also identify a different person who will share out with the full committee when you come back to the main room. We ask that you discuss each of the open questions and identify the perspective or perspectives of your group on each. There's no need for you to reach consensus in your discussion, but if you have a common perspective, record that. If you don't, record the range of perspectives. Are there 5 different thoughts? Are folks broken into 2 camps or 2 minds on this? Record that all down so that we have a sense of where folks in your group are falling on these 4 questions. 30 minutes is about 7 minutes per question. Any questions before we send you off to your groups? All right, then I'm going to ask my magical staff to magically send us off to our rooms. See you all in a bit.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi, Route 5.
Hey.
I'm happy to write things down.
Okay, thank you.
Who wants to be our reporter?
I'm happy to do that if nobody else wants to.
Sure.
It doesn't sound like anyone's going to fight me on that. So, all right. So, I just lost the questions. Did they?
So they're at the top of the document. And so the first one is grade level versus grade band. So do we think, would it be more helpful to have standards, just for high school and let schools choose, or /6 through 8? Or do you think there should be 6th grade standards and 7th grade standards and 8th grade standards?
Could we recommend kind of a blend? So I'm thinking the Common Core has anchor standards, but then they also have grade specific standards. So I wonder if we could do something similar. I think it would be difficult to fill in kind of grade band content standards, but the historical reasoning and thinking standards, I think, could be lend themselves better to kind of an anchor standard format that would extend across several grades.
No, that could work, because that was something that I was thinking about as well. Because if we If it is only grade band, that is a lot of flexibility for teachers in their implementation, but it might be too much flexibility, as in they would decide which things they need to cover most immediately. But if we stick to just specific grade levels, then things might become a little bit more rigid. You have to teach these specific things only for 6th grade. And if you don't do it by 6th grade, then they might not get it or they might miss something. It will become reviewed for 7th grade and future grades. So
Yeah.
it could work.
Yeah. I love the idea of anchor standards for skills, like in the way that the Common Core does it for, like the anchor standards are really kind of the final destination. I guess I don't even strongly disagree, but my small pushback is like, I feel like often the skill standards are the ones that get neglected. Because like organizationally they're in a different part, like the content ones are like in one part, and and I think that the skills kind of do lend themselves to a grade band approach as opposed to an like individual year approach. But I guess what is the best way to do that so that they don't get, I guess, short shrift?
I wonder if, if maybe we organize it like the Common Core, where you have the anchor standards and then each grade level, it's within that anchor standard framework.
Yeah.
So I'm a special education teacher too, and so that would make it a lot easier for me to kind of differentiate things. To say, we might be working on slightly different content, or hopefully not, but we're still attacking the same skills that other kids are.
Yeah. I guess is there strong dissent on this question, or Alex, thoughts?
I don't really feel strongly about either because I'm not really sure, to be totally honest. I mean, I kind of feel that I'm not sure which one of you said it earlier, but I think it's important that there at least is a structure given to like the teachers where like we don't want to make it so that they have to like they can cover all of these things in the course of 3 years. I think it may be easier for say US history. Maybe I mean I kind of feel like it depends on the teacher or it depends on the school. Maybe both could happen where I mean I don't really know, but I feel like there definitely are benefits for both because if you can do it through like 3 grades, maybe the transition will like things will make more sense for students if they're learning like US history across 3 years where if there's like nice blends, but also you don't want to have it sort of be like, oh, in 5th grade you learn US history, 6th grade world history, 8th grade US history, and that's sort of something that like that's been my experience where we jump from like social studies subject from like 2 years after we go back to it. So maybe like learning things in a greater unit with each other helps students understand, but I don't think this is like necessarily the most important question, and I'm not really sure where I stand on it.
Interesting. I think as maybe another reason for I think the current standards are kind of arranged how we're recommending too, to some extent. But I think another reason perhaps to ensure that we do maintain the grade level standards is implementation. Or hopefully some curriculum will be developed around these. And I think it'd be much more difficult if this is 2nd grade or kindergarten through 3rd grade. To build out a curriculum for that.
Yeah. Are any of you high school teachers?
No. Are you?
Yeah. Because the one other thing is a lot of states have grade level standards K-8 for content and then kind of give schools a menu for high school of sort of like, these are the courses for US or the standards for World 1 and the standards for World 2 and the standards for civics and and then like, but it's up to the high school which ones they do. And again, I don't have strong feelings on that, but just coming from an IB perspective, like we pretty much ignore the DC content standards in high school because we're having to do the IB courses. Also, we're a charter, and so there's no accountability, so we do live our best lives. Yeah, just kind of, I guess that's something that isn't super well solved. Like, we theoretically meet all the standards at some point in high school. We don't, but theoretically we say we do, and we do it in the order we feel like. And so just another thought that I don't think standards are not going to resolve that necessarily.
Yeah, it seems like being on this committee and just teaching in general, there is this tension between wanting to know kind of like what we're supposed to be doing and then also wanting autonomy to kind of like do whatever we want. And I think it's really difficult in a situation like this to kind of map out what we want to tell people they should be learning, because you will run up against both of those challenges. I think if it's not specific enough, people will be frustrated that they don't feel like they have, I think, a clear plan. But if it's too prescriptive, then people will feel, I think, trapped and frustrated as well. I
said, so I'll just kind of make a note that that's like a tension that we're acknowledging exists and continues to be an open question. But I cut you off, so continue.
Oh no, I guess I lean more towards more of a prescriptive and detailed kind of grade by grade level account, because they are not strongly enforced. So schools that really want to follow it closely, I think, will have the option, and then for other schools that want to kind of pick and choose what they want to take, they'll have the opportunity as well. But that'll be up to the schools to make that decision. At least we'll provide them with something to base that on.
Right, because if the structure is solid enough with what the schools will be provided, they will be able to make the best decision on their students and how they want to move with the content. But we do need to move to the second question. Thank you, Ms. Caitlin, for the time warning.
Great timekeeper.
Because it's already
so we need, it's always an essential group role for group work is the timekeeper. You've got your scribe, you've got your reporter. So the next question is keeping the current themes, which I think are your sort of classic SPICE themes of social, political, intellectual, cultural, economic, and I can pull it up, or adding new themes.
I'm fine keeping the current themes.
Yeah. I likewise feels like fine with the themes. Like I could come up with more jazzy ones that I might use in my classroom, like based on these. That's more rebranding of what's already there rather than saying that, economics shouldn't be a theme.
Yeah. I think my issue is more with, and I'm not for throwing out the standards completely. I think there's a lot of good things in them. It's just updating some of the perspectives and putting more emphasis and less emphasis on certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the kind of architecture of them and the I guess the components that we're talking about now, I think that I'm fine retaining that.
Could there be different themes for different social studies topics? Like if we're learning about U.S. history, instead of just saying social, maybe we could go into more depth about what particular social themes, or because I don't know, I just feel like from a student perspective, like for us, it's like spec, social, political, economic, culture. And those four like main themes are in every history class. And it's just kind of like, you're probably not going to go into like as much depth about like world history in a specific country as you would in like US history. So maybe it would allow us to like go into more depth and cover things and cover like their impacts beyond the surface of maybe particular events or like anything really that's in our nation that's not like you can't necessarily just say, oh, it had the social impact of this. I don't know. I think sometimes having the broad themes can like result in not accurately portraying all of the things that are happening.
Got it. So just to make sure I captured this right, like you think it would be helpful if like in the US history one, there was like social, if social was a theme, but also like a couple bullets of like in the US history context, here are some sort of sub themes or other ideas that are more concrete, specifically related, so that there's kind of that continuity across grades, but there's also a chance for something to be more meaningful.
Yeah, I think that would be perfect. Like under social, there was also like racial and or like race, gender, and then like if you put something like LGBTQ, I feel like that would allow more so the social studies standards to actually go into depth about like particular groups and groups of people, because instead of just asking like, oh, how did the New Deal, how did FDR's New Deal impact American society, you could say, okay, how did FDR's New Deal impact Black people, or how did it like impact people beyond just the general idea of like the economy and society? I think if you could go into more depth, then it would allow for much more nuance and like discussion. And
Great. So Lamar, thoughts?
No, I was gonna clarify what Alex was saying as well. Like, it looks like we're looking for more specificity beneath the themes that we already have, because the more specific we are, if we use some of these themes as kind of the umbrella terms, but really pinpoint specific people or specific groups underneath those different areas, then it will be more impactful for our students to like make comparisons between them. Like the example that Alex was giving about how FDR's New Deal affected different groups of people differently. All of those would be considered social impact, but they are all impacts in different societies. So like different microcosms of the same overall scope of the event.
Great.
I think one thing we want to make sure too, though, is to think about intersectionality. So I worry a little bit about like, the Black perspective, Latino perspective, the female perspective, because they all intersect. And so I do think that we should elevate these different perspectives that have not received enough attention in the past, but think about how we do that so we're not treating, the Black perspective is varied. So, the Latinx perspective is varied too, and the way that policies affect people of Latinx intersect with class and gender and religion and many other factors. So I think that we want to make sure that the students understand that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. The thing that I want to add in is like, I keep saying the word formatting, but I think the way the current standards has the themes, they're not really formatted in a way that's useful, because it's just like a little letter at the end of each one. And some standards have like 17 letters after them. There's not 17 themes, but like, it's like, this is every theme, which is true.
Yeah.
And so, I think that the AP US history standards are formatted in a way that makes the connections like to a theme really obvious in a way that teachers could be useful. And so the emerging consensus that I hear, and then feel free to add or push back, is we don't feel strongly about any one set of themes. They're all kind of the same, but we do think specificity, getting more specific or breaking them apart and also formatting for use is important to make them meaningful. We also worry about losing intersectionality and interthematic connections when examining events.
I think that captures you like that. Thank you for taking notes.
Thank you for letting me take notes. I love it.
Should we move on to the next question?
Yes, I think we're at the halfway mark. Including the C3 framework.
I don't have strong feelings one way or another. I think maybe there is a benefit to including it because it's well known and pretty well respected, I think. So if it's not broken, then maybe we should include, and in reality, I think teachers, we do have a curriculum problem, at least in DCPS, and teachers pull from a lot of outside resources. And so if that's kind of baked into our standards, that would be really helpful.
This is the one that I feel the most strongly about, I think. I also feel strongly about the next one, but I also just think the C3 framework really pushes away from the monotonous stereotype of bad history instruction is memorize a bunch of shit towards, I use that word deliberately here, towards like, let's really ask questions, investigate, research, active. And I think all of the pushes that we can help our colleagues have towards that is good. So besides the reasons cited, I strongly feel like we should use as much of the C3 as possible.
I would agree because I'm not super familiar with the C3 framework. I only first started looking at it when it was referenced in one of our earlier meetings, but there's like an immediate focus on inquiry and questioning and a more active way to engage with history, like building arguments, developing claims, studying the causes and effects of everything, instead of just, like you said, memorizing a bunch of stuff. Like using the C3 framework encourages a more active way to study history, civics, and just all of those things overall, rather than just learn them passively. And there are also some pieces that really connect learning social studies and history with learning English. So they have similar ways of being taught when that really brings out the humanities portion of social studies or history.
Cool. So I wrote yes times 100. This is very important to us.
Cool. Well, maybe we only have about 7 minutes left, so maybe we should move on to the last one. So Becca, it sounds like you had a strong position on this final issue.
So the final one is the inclusion of specific lists of people, places, events, or no lists, or less specific lists. I think lists are really, really important, but not as you must do this, as you can do this. And so again, I taught APUSH for a couple of years before I moved to DC. And I just think the way they do it is really smart. So like if the standard is, and I think they pulled the CJ Walker one from mine, like during the industrial era, people like entrepreneurs entrepreneured. Obviously the standard is better than that. And then they would say example. And I think that who that example is really important. And like, I think is really a chance to create some more representative social studies, because I think that, like a lot of times it's not that people want to exclude stories, but just like the first person that a lot of people would probably think of would be Rockefeller or Carnegie. But if it said in there, for example, Madame CJ Walker, the Black woman who started a beauty business, as like here, like here's an example, and like you don't have to teach about Madame CJ Walker, Madam, I don't know how she said it, but like you can choose, like talk about Rockefeller if you want, but as a standard, as a city, we're kind of suggesting that this is the person that you could use to illustrate this point. This is an event, and I think that helps push people towards something that maybe they themselves don't know.
I like the point that you made, and I also think having some type of concrete example is really helpful from an implementation standpoint. I think we're always, I feel struggling to find resources, and I don't think that it's always the highest quality resources that we find because there's not a clear consensus on what we should be doing. So I think specificity is helpful with that regard. I wonder about getting public input about which specific people we include, and if that would be an opportunity to reach out and engage with the broader DC community about who they might want to see included for these specific examples.
I feel like that would definitely. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I also like the idea of bringing up like when we talk about a specific theme or specific topic that we bring up like an example of like a person who we think may be left out of the conversation, because I think that will help like whenever they're writing the standards, like or whenever people are looking at the standards, if they see like you were saying like like successful business people or like or if they're looking at like a particular issue and they don't think to like talk about how like a Black person may have done it successfully or like how it may have affected a particular group of people that like they may just glance over. I think maybe just having that example there, while it doesn't necessarily have to be binding, can help like people draw inspiration for something they may want to talk about. And I also think it like if we were to include it in the guiding principles when it gets sent to OSSE to make their own standards, I think it would also help them like factor in, okay, like we're seeing like these things about like these examples of like people, and maybe they'll just feel more urged to include like a standard about like a particular group because they're seeing that we're placing like an emphasis on like maybe not leaving out a particular group or not leaving out like an event. So I just think it couldn't hurt as long as like we don't say like, oh, you have to talk about XXX, like you don't have to talk about these specific people, but I think like examples are, and then try to get like a broad range of examples. I think that would help.
So diversify our selection of character models, basically. Like give them examples, but don't make it so that these are the specific people you have to study for this specific theme or this specific event, because we want to make sure that we are not discounting any of the stories that could be taught in that time. But we could encourage them to like look at stories or perspectives that might not be as readily introduced in the existing standards. Because I know one of the concerns was, even though it was a minority concern, there are people who are worried that if the social studies standards are changed completely, it will feel like propaganda.
Yeah.
And that certain perspectives will just be seen as we can't teach that anymore because what that was not enough, even though there is some value in like some of the things that are more westernized. Like there are still pieces of American history that are important that need to be taught. But if we completely eliminate everything, I'm going kind of extreme because this is where some people's fear might be, we would be doing a very similar thing. We would be discounting a large selection of stories and narratives for the sake of forwarding our agenda. And that's what people are kind of scared of when they talk about turning it into propaganda. So we can talk about some of the figures that already exist and are already talked about, of course, but we can supplement that with other stories that are oftentimes ignored.
Great.
Cool. Well, thank you for the discussion, everyone. Looks like we're
I wrote our consensus as yes, give examples, make it clear these are examples, and optional teachers have the freedom to go into a specific incident, person, etc. of their choice that illustrates the broader standard. These examples should tilt towards hidden histories, examples that people might not know about. But to the point that you just made, Lamar, should we add in, but also include standard examples as well? Okay.
I also just think broad examples too. So like not a particular group, but just to encompass like all of the potential like various forms of like a particular standard and how people could take it. They have more options, like they'll be less closed-minded.
Great. Cool. So great, thanks. We'll see if other groups threw down and had more disagreement, but
Yeah.
cool.
Seems like we've been joined by some folks too.
You were all magically whisked back to the main room, so I apologize if we lost anyone mid-sentence. It happens often in breakout room settings that we lose someone mid-sentence. My apologies to folks who got themselves caught in the main room, but you became the magical group 6, so thank you for rolling with that. I could see chats coming in, but WebEx would not allow me to respond. So I was frantically texting the staff to get to you so that you were not left hanging. I am very excited to hear from each of the groups, and so we're going to ask groups to share out. We're going to give each group about 3 minutes to do their share out. So I'll put a timer on it just so we can maximize time. I am happy to go in order of groups or to let someone self-nominate to go first. Looks like Molly is ready to go for group 1, so I'm just going to give it to Molly, and then Molly, you can choose who goes next.
Uh-oh. Okay. So for the first point of grade level versus grade band, we had a lot of discussion about pros and cons. We were leaning towards grade level specific standards for content and skill levels across bands, specifically because it helps to make sure that teachers know what they're supposed to teach. Oh, sorry, that's my timer from our group. And that kids can get through everything. And then as far as the DC current themes, we talked a little bit about the themes that are within the C3, thinking could they provide guidance? We saw that the current themes are really content, and there's definitely things missing like culture, cultural interaction, geography could have subset with human interaction with environment. And then we got into a discussion of like, well, what do we mean by themes? Do we really mean these content, or do we mean kind of the themes of social studies? Do we mean history, social studies, or history, geography? Like, what do we mean by themes? Because that could help us be more specific there. Around the inclusion of C3, we said it could be really helpful, but how would we use it to inform content standards? We looked a little bit at Michigan and New Jersey standards. Michigan's really used C3 to think about, well, what would this look like if we were to use it as a framework? And then the lists, or having not lists versus less specific lists, we were really torn because it can be helpful to give teachers examples and help drive, open up like who they're going to talk about. But we were really concerned about them being prescriptive, or that it would not like help broaden students' diverse perspectives that they're hearing and experiencing. An idea of like, if we do have a list, it would have to be really, really expansive. And at that point, would it be actually helpful? So we were leaning more away from having lists of people who are books or times or specific things to study.
Thank you, Molly. You guys have about a minute left, so I just have one question. It sounds like as we went through, you said most of these, there was consensus on what you shared. Was there anywhere where your group did not have consensus on your leaning one way or another?
Anybody? Allie, Jennifer?
I didn't think so. I thought we were all kind of pretty much on the same page.
Cool. Sally, did you have a thought? You're on mute, Sally.
sorry about that. Yeah, I think we were maybe some mushiness at some point, but not disagreement, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. That's what I got to as the outside observer, but wanted to check that that was right. So thank you, group one.
Just
All right.
if I go next, I just having some mommy moments happening. I just want to present like have a clear moment. So my group, I kind of feel like we might have been a little bit split over the first question, which is grade band versus grade level. We definitely saw it both ways. I think in the end, we kind of came to the idea that if we stuck with, if we switched over to grade band, it might be nice to kind of add more themes to the grade band so that the flow of content from one grade level to the next was more continuous. So what I mean by that is, for, like right now for 6th grade, it's world geography, 7th grade is ancient civilizations, 8th grade is US history. So those are obviously 3 very different content areas. But if we switched to grade band standards, we might be able to have more of a fluid thematic approach to teaching history as opposed to just each grade level is completely different content. So I think that that's the consensus of what we came to, which kind of led right into question 2 about grade level themes. We kind of talked about 2 things. So I brought up the question of if we're, like grade level themes, meaning like who came up with 6th grade as world geography, 7th grade world, ancient civilizations, like who came up with the grade level themes? I was wondering if that was a question of contemplation. But again, if we could add some of the themes, I think we appreciated the list that was provided as an example on the template, but adding themes of like resistance movements or social justice, I think that those are important themes that are also very relevant to the times that we're living in and could very easily be connected to many aspects of history, regardless of the theme of the grade level. And I hope that's making sense. Please let me know if you need clarification. The third question, as far as C3, as someone who teaches in the District of Columbia Public Schools, I like C3, but I wouldn't think that it needed to be something that is mandatory. I think that we should keep it as a framework or a model in which teachers can use. I think inquiry-based instruction is amazing and powerful for students, but I would not say that it's something that teachers should kind of have to do across grade levels or content areas. And I think that my group was understanding of that. And then lastly, the fourth question, I think if I heard correctly, I think our response is in contrast to the first group. We felt that it's very important to have a list of names, but not just the names that are provided. If we're going to have lists of names or events, suggestions of who and what to teach listed, that we need to have a more inclusive list as opposed to scrapping it and taking it away. The example that I gave in my application for this committee and that I also presented to my group just now is the Black Panther Party or Huey Newton or Bobby Seale, or, just names that are very powerful to people in the Black community that would never be taught in schools. And so, one point that one of our group members, Alyssa, pointed out, which I appreciated, was that students learn better when we see how and who we're learning about relates to them, relates to ourselves, and minority groups in particular don't get enough of that history in school. So we would like to see more names included as opposed to taking the names and events away.
All right. Thank you, Melanie. Okay, so we've heard from groups 1 and 4. Melanie, which group do you want to hear from next?
3.
Group 3.
Okay. Jessica and I are going to sort of do this together, but in the interest of time, I'll hop in there. On the grade level subject, we kind of came down on the side of a lot of openness to the idea of grade bands at the elementary level for reasons that maybe are acknowledge the limited amount of time that we really end up getting in the school day for social studies. But I think it ties into some of these thoughts that people are having about themes that might continue over the grades. So we didn't really see how grade bands would work at the secondary level. So anyway, that's I think that there was general consensus on the idea that skills could continue to be sort of thought of in bands, but that the content itself probably needed to stay as is, but with the idea that there may be some value to thinking about the elementary grades differently. In terms of the second question about themes, we sort of acknowledged that we didn't think that those things that were being asked about really were themes but disciplines, and that we didn't think that you could have social studies standards where you weren't sort of addressing those disciplines and so and probably the way in which they're being treated now as opposed to as separate strands makes sense given the need, the real way in which they're going to be integrated as they're being taught. But then we kind of got excited about this idea of themes that might the sort of what we were thinking of as themes, and maybe a way of sort of thinking about that in the limited time that we had to is big questions, big ideas. I mean, is there a way of sort of asking some big ideas that then get addressed over, that sort of start in elementary and build throughout the years. So we didn't have a whole lot of time to think about that, but we would very much like to have that as something that the writing committee wrestled with. And we were okay with that ending up feeling a little bit like curriculum, or maybe getting a little close to feeling like curriculum. Jessica, did you want to say anything on that?
You are crushing it. Keep going, Barbara.
Okay, C3. We had actually a little group, and it got even littler during it. So it was kind of down to Jessica and me. I'm kind of like, right. I'll raise my hand. I don't see how C3 really fits in here, and Jessica said she didn't really know. So I think others have. I'd sort of weigh in where others are. I don't really see how the C3 framework. It has a lot of use here and in terms of what's we're trying to accomplish here. Lists, like others, we struggled on this one. I think it would be fair to say that we don't want to, I think Jessica, isn't how Melanie said it pretty right on in terms of where we fell? We don't want to not have specificity in here. That is disserving, our students if they don't have access to, names, date, and I don't care about dates as much but I do care about chronology, but certainly events and that kind of thing. But there are a lot of people and events that have been left out, and so there needs to be a hard scrub given. And I don't think any of us knows how that's up to them, the writers, to struggle with the balance that needs to be achieved between those things that are on there now and those things that are admittedly sort of left off and should be there. But weighing in favorably on the side of specificity. Anything I left off, Jessica?
Thank you. Did an amazing job. And then we had some great note taking. So there's some extra details on the document too.
Yeah, the notes are fantastic. So thanks to everyone who did the recording, because there's some really great notes. Jessica and Barbara, who do you want to hear from next? We've heard from 1, 4, and 3. We got
to do 2, right? Just to sort of
All right, 2.
All right. This is Karen. Our group on grade level versus grade bands discussed, like many other groups, about how grade bands can be more flexible. But that also depends on how we define the bands, and we did a little bit of discussing about what those bands might look like, which are in our notes. But then we also talked about the possibility, and actually we kind of, I think it was group 3 that just presented, we kind of came out on the opposite end in terms of how we were thinking about it. We were thinking about sticking with grade level for the earlier grades and using grade bands for the upper grades. And if there was some way to kind of have a hybrid of using both models, but for different age ranges. For sticking with current themes versus adding new themes, we felt like there's something missing, and we kind of struggled to name what exactly that is. Some possibilities we discussed were, in addition to military action, adding something about humanitarian action or like social movements or something like that. But we feel like something's missing from that list, but we weren't quite able to nail down what exactly that is. Inclusion of the C3 framework, we all seem to lean toward yes. And that was probably one of the shorter questions. We didn't spend a lot of time on that, but we all said yes, that C3 is like the framework would be useful. For inclusion of specific lists of people and places, we talked a lot about kind of the pros and cons of listing versus not having a list, and discussing that, especially for teachers who maybe didn't learn the entire histories, or especially in earlier grades. Sarah was sharing some of her experience, that not having information could be more harmful than providing examples for teachers to reference, because then you could have, if we provided categories without examples of individuals or events, then you may have scenarios where teachers or whoever's writing the curriculum like guessing at what the standards are trying to convey in terms of who should be represented. But also struggled with like how to decide who should be on those lists and how to ensure they're inclusive and representative. Let's see, did I miss anything? Elena?
I think you got everything.
Yep. That was great, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Who would you like to go next? We got groups 5 and 6 still to hear from.
How about group 6?
All right, group 6.
So I recorded the notes, so I don't want to speak for the group on this part, but I will if no one else wants to. Sorry, because of the lag in time, we didn't get to assign roles as formally.
Mike, you can go ahead. Do you have all the notes? You've got it.
Okay, cool. So I'll go ahead and jump on and say, yeah, we unfortunately did not get to the last question. So for the first 3, to go through them pretty rapidly, we leaned heavier on a grade level approach on that one. I think I've heard a lot of similar ideas shared so far. I'll say, I think 2 that we stressed for that is that it would give schools, teachers, LEAs a lot of helpful structure and clarity when designing curriculum. And I think an original idea I haven't heard yet was that it would also ensure sort of a greater amount of accountability within grades to ensure that essential content and material is taught, which is a concern. I know that I've heard at a couple of these meetings. For the second issue on themes, there's pretty strong consensus in terms of revising themes, revising by both deleting existing ones as well as adding new ones. We, as I've heard other groups say, so I won't harp on this, just noted that themes that exist now don't stress things like diversity, inclusion, or civics. But then we actually pivoted to a larger question of ultimately, what is the point of having themes if the document itself is not going to be written, organized, created in such a way that will equip and support LEAs in creating thematic curriculum. We noted how the current DCSS gives a little shout out to how great and wonderful thematic teaching is, but it doesn't really seem to do much to support that development. We've heard other groups talk about how disjointed some of the grade bands are, and we echoed that as well. And then I think for the last one, for the C3 framework, we had varying opinions on this, ranging from a little cool but accepting to very warm. But I think an interesting idea that I heard at the end, and that I've seen also in some of the comments that scan these that's similar, is a question of ultimately, are things like the inquiry design model, are they best served as a guide for an individual or an LEA when they're designing a department philosophy or creating a guide for curriculum, rather than being served as a framework for standards?
All right. Very helpful. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate the piece about the themes not just being about including, but also how they are included. Our group one had some conversation around other state standards that do interesting things in that respect. Last but not least, group 5, who has really awesomely organized notes.
And that's all, Becca. So to the first point about standards, I think that we held similar views to the other groups, that we came down in support of specificity, grade level specificity, particularly with regard to content, but we're more open to having skills perhaps span across several grades. Regarding themes, we didn't have really strong opinions on it. The current themes that are included or disciplines we thought were fine. One thing that we noted that Group 6 just said was kind of the formatting of them in the current standards, and how they aren't really, they'll make a standard and it will say like theme XYZ, so it doesn't really help for teaching thematically. So we thought and discussed a little bit about how we could better format the standards to make them more conducive to thematic teaching. Regarding the C3 framework, we were all strongly in support of that. We thought that we like the approach that it takes, and would like to see it baked into the standards as much as possible. And then to the last point about inclusion of specific lists and people, we had similar views to the other groups, that we think that specificity is helpful, but want to ensure that there is a balance between some of the traditional figures and events that are covered, as well as some of these other groups that need to be addressed. And we want to ensure also that, and I guess it goes a little bit to the themes too, that we're acknowledging intersectionality when we talk about different groups. And then, did I miss anything else that we discussed? Doesn't look like it. So, okay.
Awesome. I appreciate the richness of the conversations, the thoughtfulness of the notes, and I want to repeat back something I think I hear as we move into some fist to 5 voting on some of the other proposed guiding principles. It feels like there is more consensus, though not necessarily full consensus, on grade level content, with some discussion around maybe bands in the early grades, maybe bands for skills. But by and large, what I hear from the groups is a tilt towards grade level. I hear a tilt towards lists versus no lists that are inclusive, and some question of how often those lists are updated. And so there's lots of ways that that could be tackled, but that was a thing that I heard. I do not hear clear consensus on themes or on C3 framework. Where I did hear one thing as we got towards the end that I saw some nodding towards is the idea that any themes included need to have some different formatting in the standards that make them accessible for use, whether that be for curriculum writing or lesson planning or intersections and connections across content. So with that in mind, having listened to that, we're going to take your notes and do the same thing we did with all the other content, which is basically try to pull together where we think there's agreement, where we think there's still need for discussion, so that we move forward in that process as we get towards our next meeting. I'm going to come back to my deck for a second. And let's see if this will work. Are you back to seeing my power? Looks like you are. Cool. Okay. So our next piece of this process of moving towards consensus is really to just do some quick voting. And I realize I use the term quick in a very laughable sense, because it's 23 proposed guiding principles, which in themselves take some time. But I'd like to ask each of you, if you haven't already, to open the guiding principles Google Doc so that you can physically see those 23 proposed guiding principles and not rely on me or anyone else to have to read them aloud, because some of them are quite lengthy. We're going to go through 1 to 23, as many as we can get through, this fist to 5 voting process. And for each one, I'm going to say the guiding principle number and ask you in a WebEx window. So we'll be back to looking at our Brady Bunch screen, not the PowerPoint, a visual cue as to your level of agreement with advancing this guiding principle as it is constructed now. So again, as I said before, a fist is I've got opposition. There's something fundamentally wrong with this to me, and I don't feel comfortable with this as it is. A 5 is I wholly approve of advancing it, trusting that we will wordsmith it and make it clean and nice along the way, and we'll include volunteers from our CISAC in that process. Anything in between those two ends is 1 to 4 fingers on a Likert scale. So if you're closer to I don't feel good about it, but you would with some major changes, it's a 1. And vice versa. If you're not 100%, but you're pretty close to it, it's a 4. And then a 3 is maybe you don't have an opinion or you're very much undecided. We're going to make note of the range of responses to try and find out which guiding principles we've got consensus on moving forward with, so that we can move those towards wordsmithing and making clean and nice. And those that really need further discussion, so we can figure out how to make time and space for that level of depth of discussion. Before I get rid of this slide, are there questions on this process that I can answer for folks? All right, so it looks like folks get the process. I'm gonna leave the sharing. Keeps wanting to take away my video. All right, and I'm gonna put up our screen. So if I can't see you currently, I would like to see you. If for some reason you would prefer not to be seen, you're gonna go ahead and type your number in the chat. So when we go through each of them, we'll ask you to do that way. I will go through starting with 1. And staff, can you all see what you need to see here? Cool. Okay, so for number 1, give us your fist to 5. Okay, so just so we're clear on this, I see mostly 5s and 4s with a few 3s. All right, you can put your hands down. That one appears that folks are mostly willing to advance. We'll go with guiding principle number 2. Give us your fist to 5. Okay, I am seeing almost all 5s and 4s. Awesome, thank you. Guiding principle number 3, give us your fist to 5. Okay. Staff, I'm seeing wider variation here. I've got a couple of 2s, I've got a 3, and I've got a handful of 5s. So I'm going to make note that for 3, we do not have consensus yet. Okay, you can put your hands down. Guiding principle number 4. Give us your fist to 5. Cool, and make sure I can see it up in the screen, because for some folks, I got it down here and I can't see if I've got a thumb or not. Awesome, I am seeing so far 4s and 5s. Awesome, thank you. Guiding principle number 4, we've got 4s and 5s. All right, guiding principle number 5. Give us your rating. Okay, seeing a few more hands waiting for them to come up. I've got a couple of 2s. I got a couple of 3s. Okay, so we do not have consensus on number 5. This is one we will come back to. Thank you all. Guiding principle number 6, active voice and action verbs. Give us your rating. Okay, I see 5s and 4s and a couple of 3s. So I'm going to make note here of our 3s in case folks want to follow up there. Thank you. You can put your hand down. All right, staff, are there any of those that you have questions on that we want to go back to, or can I move on to our knowledge and skills big idea guiding principles? Sounds like we can go ahead. All right, so we are coming on to number 7. Under knowledge and skills, give us your rating, fist to 5. Make sure it's nice and in the screen. Awesome. I see a lot of 5s. Great, thank you. We have consensus on number 7. Number 8. Make sure they're nice and up in the screen so we can see them all. See 5s, 4s, couple of less than 4s. All right, I'm going to call that consensus because by and large I have 5s. So number 8, we have 5s. Number 9, community-based learning. Give us your rating. Okay, we have some variation here. I see a 3 from Emily, a 2 from Becca, a 3 from Barbara. We're going to come back to this one. Thank you. Number 10, environmental context. Give us your rating. Okay, I see 5s, 4s, I see a couple of 3s. So I'm going to record some of those down. I've got Sally, Lamar, and Reggie with 3s. So we're going to come back to this one. Number 11, student agency and voice. Give us your rating. Okay, that's strong consensus. I've got lots of 5s and a couple of 4s. Thank you. Coming to number 12, digital literacy. There's a lot written here, but folks had some good detailed differences. Give us your rating on digital literacy, number 12. Okay, 5s and 4s, it looks like all around. Strong consensus on that. Thank you. Okay, so I realize I missed 2 comments, so I want to pause for a second and make sure I can go back to these 2 comments just so I don't lose them in which ones we're talking about. So, Sally, you say, can you be more expansive of the meaning of these? Too short, meaning the specific, like what I'm saying here when I announce them? And Sally, you're on mute, so I can't hear you if you're speaking.
No, for these little short ones, I don't really know I can guess what environmental context means. To me, they're too short to give a vote this meeting.
Okay.
I don't know if they're explained in any more depth. So as you go through the really short ones, maybe just give a little more explanation. At least I think we've gone through the short ones, so it doesn't matter now. But
okay, that's helpful. And I think as we move towards further discussion on those, getting into the details of what we mean will be very important. And then, Emily, can the description for number 10 be updated to reflect a difference for number 9?
Sorry, I meant difference from number 9. In the document I'm looking at, they have the same description with just like a little bit more for number 10. So I can't really tell how they're different.
Yep, that might be my problem. I may have pasted the wrong thing. It looks like Alex is fixing my mistake. So we'll come back to number 10 because that seems to be a number of questions we've got there. And then I saw one more comment from Karen. 1 and 2 seem like they go together. So as we get into the final drafting of that and we have folks coming together to wordsmith, let's take a look at 1 and 2 together based on that comment. All right, I'm going to jump us back into number 13. Number 13 is a skill and talks about, this was a lot of different folks' comments around skills in the social studies standards that complement the ELA standards, things like research, discourse, debate. All right, I've got lots of 5s and 4s here, so we're going to go ahead with consensus on 13. If at any point I steamroll over something and you think I've missed you, please go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll keep checking those. Number 14, democratic citizenship, civic dispositions, and experiences. These were folks thinking about and classifying how we should talk about the role of civics, not just as constitutional learning. Give us your rating on 14. Great. I see 5s and 4s here. We're going to go ahead with consensus on 14. More than halfway done, folks. We're moving into a new big idea. These fell together under the big idea of diversity and inclusion. Number 15 is about explicit inclusion of groups folks feel are missing. Let's get your rating on number 15. All right, we have mostly 5s, consensus on 15. 16, reflecting DC throughout the standards, not just in DC history. Okay, I have some 5s, some 4s, some 3s. I'm going to call this one pretty strong consensus, but Mike, I'm going to make note that you seem to have some questions or reservations. Let's come to number 17. Perspective in authoring the standards. Let's get your rating on number 17. I've got 5s, 4s, and 1, 2. So I'm going to put consensus, but I'm going to come, Barbara, and put your note here to come back and follow up with you. Looks like I have some notes here in the chat. Okay, I see that note on number 14, Jessica, and some strong seconds and thirds from Karen and Fadal and a whole bunch of nodding. So make a note on number 14. Number 18, identity, intersectionality, diversity. Let's get ratings on what we have under number 18. I see a note from Sally, adding in global. I'm looking to see my fingers. Okay, looks like 4s and 5s with the note on adding global from Sally. Number 19. This was about American exceptionalism. There were lots of interesting thoughts here on this. So number 19, see your rating. Looks like 5s and 4s. Maybe some folks who want to help us wordsmith some of that, but we have consensus. Lizzie, I'm going to make note about yours on number 18 as well, the concern about national identity. Coming down to the home stretch here. Number 21, global perspectives, emphasis in the standards currently on Western or Eurocentric perspectives. So number 20. I'm sorry, 21. Nope, I got lost here in my own numbers. My apologies. Go back to number 20. The new social studies standard should ensure that the topics, themes, and people provide windows and mirrors. Get your rating on that. You see 5s and 4s. Looks like Alex is a 3, so we're going to have a note here to follow up with Alex, mostly 5s and 4s. Thank you. Now we're coming to 21. More global perspective and de-emphasizing Western or Eurocentric perspectives. Okay, I see 5s and 4s. I see a 3 from Sally. So Sally, I'm going to make a note here for you. I'm also seeing in the chat that there are questions around the wording on 20. And there are thoughts that 18 and 20 might come together. So I'm going to make note that we should discuss those perhaps as a group. And it looks like Alex and Sally and Lizzie all had thoughts on that. So I may follow up with those 3 folks in particular. Other folks want to be followed up on. Let's go ahead and drop that in the chat. Okay, and Jessica, that's a good note on 21. All right, 2 more. Number 22, under this big idea, there was really only one theme that seemed to come out to fit as a guiding principle. And this is around, it kind of goes back to our lists and our themes. So read 22 carefully and then give me your fist to 5. Okay, we're a little all over the map here. We've got some 4s, we've got some 5s, we've got quite a few 3s. So I'm going to have us come back to 22 as a point of additional group discussion. And then number 23, this was not in any of the big ideas, but was suggested. and seemed worth including for discussion by this group. So fist to 5 on this being a guiding principle for consideration. All right, we are again sort of all over the board here because we've got 1 fist, we've got a 2, a 2, a 3, some 5s, some 4s. So 23 is also one that we do not have consensus on and would need to have further discussion. Okay. Okay, your hands must be exhausted now from all of that voting, but you are all awesome, and I appreciate the process that you went through on this. Alex and staff, I have notes here, just please check for me, that we do not have consensus on number 3, 5, and 6, on 9 and 10. 18 and 20 need further discussion, and we have a few folks self-identified for that. And then 22 and 23. So one more time, we don't have consensus on 3, 5, 6, 9, 10, 22, or 23. And then there's more discussion needed on 18 and 20. There are a few others that I'm going to follow up with individual folks who put notes in, but by and large, we have consensus on the others. John Paul is giving me affirmation, so that is awesome. I'm hugely relieved because you all have worked incredibly hard to get us to this point. But before we go on to next steps, I want to ask a question. What's missing? Is there anything we did not include in that list of 23 that jumps out at you that's been on your mind that you have wanted to make sure got included that is not there? It's possible that we got it all, but I want to make sure that we're not leaving anyone thinking, you know, I mentioned this thing and it is not included in there, and that's a problem.
Is there a reflection of this idea that there would be themes that, and I'm using themes not as disciplines, which I think is what that list of what had been called themes were, but do we have contained in here the idea that I thought I heard from all of the groups reporting out that there was some place potentially for ideas or themes that we want to see recurring big questions that we want to see recurring over time?
Barbara, I agree with you. I think we heard that in the report out, and we obviously don't have that included in the 23, but that definitely jumped out to me as well. And so when we go through those 4 open questions and try and put those in, I think that is something that will come out from the notes for sure. Alex, it looks like your hand is up as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I really like the principles from what I've seen. Something that I would just want to like make sure doesn't like get lost when we're talking about like the diversity and inclusion is that specifically I think something that's important is when we're talking about like historical events or when we're talking about historical trends and themes that we specifically say how they affected a group of people and not just saying like, oh, let's include like the history of these people, but like let's talk about how this particular policy affected these particular groups. And like just from like what I was reading, I kind of felt like that wasn't explicitly stated, and I feel like that's something that's important so that there isn't a disconnect between like a certain event, but then like it wasn't just it was happening to like a certain group of people in America. Like it wasn't just that like only these people were affected by it. If you could examine how like all of these different groups were experience this in like all of these different sorts of ways, I think that's something that would help just like so that we don't fall into a place where specifically like when we're learning about Black people that like we jump from period to period when we learn about them instead of like just learning about them continuously and learning about their own experiences, that it isn't like we hear about them in the 30s and then in the 60s and then in the 90s, so that we don't like leave out important like gaps of time or events. So
I think that's really well received, Alex. It sounds like there's some comments in the chat affirming it, as well as some nodding along. And so I'm hearing clearly that we're thinking not just about events in history, but also impact, and impact that may be disproportionate on different groups, as well as impact that carries over from time to time, so that it's not just a moment in time history, but this thread of impact over time for groups. Anything else that is missing? There's a really good conversation in the chat happening about service learning, so we'll definitely capture that. Becca, are you jumping in?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's missing is the role of the social sciences, like outside of history, which I know we've had discussions about. And I don't know whether there was consensus on that or. And then I think just something that's come up tonight and throughout our others is the level of change and uniqueness people have appetite for, like whether it's completely changing, like, are we kind of keeping the grade, expecting that the grade themes will stay what they are? Do we feel like the standards writers have license to totally change everything in the sequence? I think that's something that would be helpful to give guidance on.
Got it. So giving guidance to OSSE on the level of change we believe that there's appetite for as a district. Okay. The role of the social sciences is a good call out. Thank you, Becca. Anything else that we are missing that is burning for folks?
Yeah, I just want to add in off of Alex's comment, which I thought was great. We're not addressing the fact that we teach history out of context to the present day. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why it's so problematic. Everything that's happening today can be tied to things in our history, and I don't see that being represented.
Got it. Okay, I see your note.
There's an interesting possibility that that's your big question, that that's your theme, that that's what sort of drives the, the recurrence across over the grades.
That's an interesting point. Jessica, I see your note on number 17, so we'll definitely make note on that one. With this in mind, I've heard some things that are missing. We have the 4 open questions that you all discussed. We have places where there is consensus and where there is not consensus. And we have about 7 minutes left. What I don't think we can probably have a thoughtful conversation on is these areas of no consensus yet. But looks like Sally has something to say, and then I want to talk about how we can approach this getting to consensus on some of the open questions. Sally?
Hi. I'm sitting here in the dark. You can shut me down because in a way, I feel I may be coming in too late with this comment, but I kind of feel now that we have somewhat of a grab bag of principles, but but it doesn't reflect maybe the coherence of our thinking. I feel like what maybe I thought we were going to get to at some point, but I think we can back into it, is sort of a broader philosophical point of view about what we are teaching social studies for. Because it can connect obviously so many of these principles connect with each other. If you believe that the purpose of social studies, our purpose in teaching social studies in the schools is to inform students about our history so that they can become engaged citizens, to put it very briefly, and fight for social justice. I mean, if that is the point, rather than receiving a set of a bunch of information to be good citizens. That's a very different frame. That second frame is the frame of the last set of standards, is that it's the responsibility of people in the United States to learn this information, to learn the Star Spangled Banner, to learn about the Founding Fathers, to be responsible citizens. But if we have a different way of looking at our purpose, it really informs all these specific principles. I think it would be a more valuable document for OSSE, and maybe even for ultimately a public-facing document, to have some kind of frame around this that I think we've been talking around, but it hasn't kind of surfaced yet.
Do others have responses to Sally's commentary?
I'm gonna just try to keep this brief. I'm in the business of education for liberation, and one of my big concerns with the current standards, and even some of what is emerging, is I'm not interested in perpetuating settler colonialism through notions of citizenship. So even that idea, I want to problematize, and I hope that our students, through studying geography and civics and history, philosophy, broader social studies disciplines, even start to question these questionable, fictitious boundaries we create. So that's my simple, not so simple, but response to your question.
Others? So Sally, given, I think what I'm hearing is that the principles alone may not reflect the kind of intent that this group may want to provide to OSSE and to standards writers as to why social studies. What I wonder is whether or not this group has a common vision of why social studies, and whether it's possible for us to get to one. But I do think that thinking about whether we have a perspective on why the standards need to be revised might be a way to approach an intro to the principles. Becca, your point is a good one, and I agree. I'm not so inclined to have this group write something that's more like the preamble to the standards, because I worry that it crosses out of our zone of work and into the standards writers. But I do wonder about some sort of statement on these principles are offered in the spirit of X as the purpose of the social studies. So Jessica's point to education for liberation, and this is why these revisions are needed. So I do want to come back to that thinking the next time we gather. What I want to propose with 2 minutes left is that the team and I are going to pull together notes based on your good small group conversations and where areas are still needed to discuss and derive for consensus. I'm going to follow up with some individual people who raised particular points or questions around places where we did have consensus and did not, because I would like not to be the only leader of the consensus building, but I'd like for those of you who expressed reservation or strong opinion to help us lead this process of getting to consensus or eliminating guiding principles as part of the work between now and November, and then shaping the agenda for the November meeting. So I think what I'm going to suggest, the last couple slides are just a reminder that our next meeting is on November the 10th, and a reminder that between now and then, we're going to have to do some work to move these guiding principles from where they are to a more wordsmithed version of themselves towards greater clarity. And then we're going to have to use our time on the 10th and in between now and the 10th to get to consensus on some of these places we don't have it. So I will follow up with folks who raised opinions or raised question about places where they wanted to see different wording or different suggestions. If you have places that you did not put in comments in the chat or comments tonight, but that are on your mind, like I really want to say something about number 10, please go ahead and send that to us. Otherwise, we will follow up with notes and a more clear list of next steps for this group between now and November the 10th. Alex or John Paul, is there anything that I am missing?
Good to go, Dr. Sutter.
All right. Thank you all. This was an incredibly productive meeting. I'm sorry that I don't have clarity on what the next steps are yet, but getting all this together and following up with individuals of you is going to be much, very helpful in that regard. So thanks all for your time. Have a great night. Rest those brains. Bye.
And Jessica, thank you. And John Paul, thank you too. And I'm being funny, but kind of serious. Depending on how things shake out, that first week of November, I plan to still come, but I might need some time. So I'm just going to put that out there.
I hear that. We might all need some time.